In this video, I'm going to share my succulent care tips as well as talk about the top 5 mistakes most people make when caring for succulents and how to avoid them. Succulents are really beautiful plants that can be really easy care when you know how to take care of them. However, it's really easy to make mistakes when caring for succulents because their care is a little bit different to the average houseplant. Now, I'm using succulent as a general term for really drought-tolerant plants such as echeverias or haworthias, but it can refer to a lot of different types of plants. Any plant really that retains moisture in their leaves and their stems and are really drought-tolerant. Now, drought-tolerant should also give you a clue to succulent care. And while they can be really easy care plants, there are a few mistakes that some people make. And there's a cat showing off in the background of the video. While succulents can be really easy care plants, there's a couple of mistakes that people often make that can be easily avoided when you know what to do. Mistake number 1, overwatering. Succulents, as mentioned, are drought-tolerant plants. They don't require a lot of water. And being very moisture retentive, when they have too much water, they tend to get root rot, leaf rot, or stem rot. If you find that your succulent leaves are getting a little mushy, if the stem looks mushy, if the leaves are going a bit yellow, check the soil and make sure it's not overly wet. One mistake people make with any plant care is having like a regular routine of watering and just putting a date on the calendar and saying, oh, I water once a week, once a day, once a month. Really, you should be going by the soil of your plant. Check the soil. If the soil is moist, if it's very moist, do not water that plant. Let the soil completely dry out before you water again, and that should help avoid overwatering these plants. They can be really sensitive to overwatering and start to rot if they're sitting in standing water. If you find that you have a succulent that is suffering from rot, if the stem is getting a little bit squishy or the leaves, my advice is to clip that succulent, let it completely callus over and dry before replanting in dry soil. As long as you have removed the rot from the stem or taken the leaves off from the rotted stem, it should be able to re-root and propagate itself, and you can save that plant. Mistake number 2 is related to watering. You're going to want to make sure that your succulents are planted in the correct soil. You want to make sure that your succulents are in a really nice, well-draining soil. You can often purchase ready-made succulent type soil, which is great. It usually has added sand, perlite, vermiculite, less organic material. You want to make sure that the soil you use doesn't retain too much water, that allows really good drainage for the water to flow past the roots. You want to make sure your plants aren't sitting in a really soggy, mushy soil. Related to that is also if your succulents are in a pot, that it has a drainage hole. Now, not all pots have drainage holes, such as this decorative pot, and that's why I use a cache pot. You can see I actually just recently watered this, but there are drainage holes in this. And that way I can be sure that the water is going to completely drain out and it's not going to cause the rot that you can get from overwatering. Mistake number 3 is underwatering or misting your succulents. I know that sounds contradictory since I just said overwatering is a huge mistake, but underwatering your succulents or using a mister to water them is really bad for them. These are plants that do not like to be in a humid environment. They don't like moisture attached to their leaves. They can often get fungal issues from water that stays on their leaves, such as powdery mildew, and even drought-tolerant plants need a good watering. So my recommendation with succulents is not to mist, but to make sure that once your soil has completely dried out and drained, you give them a good, deep watering. Make sure that soil gets fully saturated, but is allowed to drain off. So if you don't water them enough, they can start to get kind of wrinkled looking leaves. It's very common. I have a lot of succulents that are planted in the ground. It's very common in the summertime for them to lose their leaves and go dormant and go a little bit wrinkly. They can really survive long periods of time without watering, and that's why it's safer to leave the watering times longer than too soon. However, they do want that really good soaking so that they can retain the water back into their leaves, and that's how they survive droughts, and that's what makes them succulents. I often think of plant care as, how does this plant survive in the wild? So a lot of these succulents, we're here in California, and this is a perfect example. It's winter here. We've just had a huge atmospheric river come through, several days of heavy rain, and then we won't have rain for months. And my succulents are green, they're lush, they've gotten that water that will sustain them for the next couple of months, and then they're good and they don't need to be watered again. For my succulents that are in my garden, the in-ground succulents, we have a drip irrigation system. We turn it off in the winter because we get the rains, and then in the summertime, we do maybe once or twice a week, a couple of minutes of watering. In the winter, we turn the drip irrigation off because it is our wet season and we get natural rain and even mist in the mornings. And in the summertime, when it is completely dry, that's when we turn the drip irrigation on. The water doesn't spray onto the leaves. It goes directly dripped into the soil for a few minutes, a couple of times a week, and that is enough to sustain my plants. Succulent mistake number 4, not enough light. Succulents need very bright, indirect light to be happiest, and it is quite tough to have succulents as indoor plants. I don't have any of my succulents indoor because I just cannot produce enough light to keep them happy. Succulents are going to want 6 to 7 hours of very bright indirect sunlight every day. And when I say indirect, that's because succulents can get sunburned with too much direct sunlight. So you have to sort of ease them into direct sunlight. They can do quite well with direct sunlight, and a lot of them, if they're used to it, can be quite happy with very bright direct sunlight. These echeverias, for example, I have them here on my patio. It gets almost direct sunlight they're underneath a pergola and they get very bright light out here, and these succulents are very happy here. I have some in my garden that have gotten quite used to really bright, really direct sunlight. A lot of times those succulents will turn a darker reddish color or brighter color. That is succulents' way of producing a little bit of like a sunscreen for themselves. When they get a little bit stressed, they do tend to go more orange, red when they're in direct sunlight. Some succulents are more sensitive than others, so succulents that I know that will turn that dark red, they're a little bit safer to be in that really hot direct sunlight, but something that's a little bit more tends to be on the green side, I'm going to keep that a little bit more indirect sunlight. Now, you can absolutely keep succulents indoors if they're in a really bright, sunny window, whether that is south or east or west facing. Of course, you can also use grow lights. And one big indication that your succulents aren't getting enough light is when they start to get what's called leggy. The stems start to grow long, and there's a lot of space in between each leaf. So all of these succulents get a lot of pretty bright direct light, so you'll see the leaves are pretty tight and compact together. But if you get a succulent that is sort of on the pale side, the green side, the color is a big indicator as well, and there's a lot of space in between each leaf, that succulent is stretching, looking for the sun, and that succulent needs more light. So if you want to keep happy succulents, make sure you keep them in a very bright location at least 6 to 8 hours a day. My final tip for this video, tip number 5, is making sure you keep your succulents in good temperature conditions. Succulents prefer being in conditions between 60 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit, so they are warm weather plants. They do prefer the kind of cooler nights and warmer days, and they can certainly adjust to hotter conditions or cooler conditions. But really, when you get in the like 100 degrees temperatures, hotter than that, they can sunburn and almost like cook internally. I've had that happen to some of my plants when we've had a heat wave. If you are in a location that gets over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, you're going to want to make sure you move your succulents into a more sheltered position, whether you use shade cloths or bring them indoors or put them in the shade. You want to protect them from that very, very intense hot sun that can really do a lot of damage to them. And equally, if you're going to be in a place that is going to get frosty or 40 degrees Fahrenheit or below, you're going to want to move them into a warmer, more sheltered location, bring them indoors into a greenhouse, somewhere to make sure that they don't freeze. So they're full of moisture. That's what makes them succulents. Their leaves are full of moisture, and if it gets below freezing, the water inside their leaves will freeze and that will kill the plant. Some succulents, such as hens and chicks, their leaves are a bit thinner. They are a little bit more frost resistant. They can happily stay in more freezing conditions, but for the most part, they are warm weather plants. Another question I get asked sometimes, I do a lot of videos about propagating succulents. You'll notice I have some little cuttings here and leaves. One of the joys of succulents is that they propagate from cuttings so easily. I have made an entire channel all about propagating plants for free, and I do get a lot of questions from people who have taken leaves or cuttings and they're not rooting and they don't know why. And a lot of times it's that they need the warmth. They need that warmth to propagate. Succulents do go dormant. Their dormancy season is a lot different to other plants. You know, a traditional tree, deciduous tree, for example, loses its leaves in the winter, and that's when it goes dormant. Succulents often do the opposite. Aeoniums, for example, they go dormant in the summer. They lose all their leaves, they get pretty dry, they kind of close in on themselves. They're not dead, they're just dormant, and they're not going to propagate at that time because it's too hot, it's too dry. They come back in what I would call the California winter time, you know, kind of between the 50 and 60 degree range. That's when they're going to propagate, but they really do need warmth and indirect light to propagate. So bear that in mind if you're trying to propagate succulents and it's not working. Just look at your light, your heat, and your water conditions. I hope this video has been helpful for those of you that are just starting your succulent journey, or if you're someone who has a lot of succulents and you're just wondering what is going on. Hopefully this video has been helpful. I do have a lot of succulent care videos, whether it's about propagation, watering, or specific types of succulents from echeverias, aeoniums, and jade plants, so be sure and check out the rest of my channel. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments below, and don't forget you can also find me on Instagram and TikTok.